Lauren Whitaker had always considered herself independent, maybe even stubbornly so. At 27, working long hours as a graphic designer in downtown Seattle, she often found herself yearning for silence, space, and a little distance from people. That October, after an especially rough breakup and a pileup of stressful deadlines, she finally acted on something she'd been putting off for months: a solo camping trip. Mirror Lake, nestled in the Snoqualmie Pass area, seemed perfect, remote enough for solitude, but not so isolated that she'd be completely alone. The trail was well-trafficked during the day and relatively mild, making it ideal for someone wanting peace without the burden of a grueling hike. Lauren wasn't naive about the risks. She'd taken basic self-defense classes, trained regularly at a shooting range, and kept a concealed Glock 43 in her pack, not because she expected trouble, but because it gave her peace of mind. A weekend surrounded by trees and silence sounded like exactly what she needed. What she didn't expect was that within 24 hours, she'd be lying awake in a tent, gun in hand, praying she wouldn't have to use it. The drive east from Seattle took just under 2 hours, winding through forests dressed in autumn gold and copper. By the time Lauren reached the Mirror Lake trailhead, the sun had started to dip low, painting the sky in soft oranges. With her pack slung over one shoulder and boots crunching over pine needles, she began the 5-mile hike into the Cascades, welcoming the rhythmic solitude of each step. The air was crisp and smelled of moss, wet earth, and decaying leaves, a scent she had always associated with clarity. As she moved deeper into the woods, the occasional hiker passed by, heading the opposite direction, offering polite nods or cheerful good lucks. It reassured her that while she was alone, she wasn't entirely isolated. By late afternoon, she found the perfect spot: a small clearing just off the main trail, with a soft slope, dry ground, and a partial view of the lake glinting through the trees. She pitched her tent, collected a small pile of firewood, and boiled water for freeze-dried chili. Under the canopy of a darkening sky, Lauren felt peace she hadn't known in months, until that peace was interrupted. By the time Lauren crawled into her sleeping bag, the forest had gone still. The last embers of her campfire dimmed to a soft glow, and the only sounds were the occasional owl and the faint rustle of wind brushing through the pines. She used her backpack and a rolled-up fleece to make a makeshift pillow, then drifted into a deep, dream-heavy sleep. In her dream, she was back in her dad's old station wagon, with her younger brother laughing and bickering about nothing. It felt warm, familiar, safe. But then something shifted. The laughter faded, replaced by the low, distinct sound of a zipper being drawn open. She looked around the car, confused. There was no tent in the dream. That's when her heart jolted. In a flash, she realized the sound wasn't coming from the dream. It was real, just inches from her head. The transition from dream to waking was brutal. Darkness swallowed everything, and in that moment, only one thought surged through her mind with terrifying clarity. "Get your gun now." Lauren's eyes snapped open to pitch-black silence. Her breath caught in her chest. The dream was gone, replaced by the unmistakable sound of her tent zipper creeping downward, tooth by tooth. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Without thinking, she reached for the side pocket of her sleeping bag, where she'd stashed the Glock 43, her fingers fumbling to grip the polymer frame. The training she'd done at the indoor range, the hours of stance practice and dry fire drills, meant nothing now. Her hands shook. Her mind raced. Adrenaline blurred every thought except one. Someone was outside and they were coming in. She tried to control her breathing, swallowing the panic bubbling in her throat. The zipper kept moving. It was halfway down. That's when she found her voice. It cracked at first, but came out firm by the second sentence. "I have a gun. Step away from the tent, or I will shoot." The zipper froze. For a few long seconds, there was only silence. Then she heard slow, deliberate footsteps, retreating, first a few, then more, crunching the forest floor. But they didn't run. Whoever it was walked away like they had all the time in the world. That was somehow more chilling. Lauren lay frozen pistol, aimed at the flap, unsure if they'd really gone, or were simply circling back. Lauren stayed frozen for what felt like hours, eyes locked on the partially unzipped tent flap, Glock still raised in both trembling hands, her ears strained for any hint of movement footsteps. Twig snapping breathing, but the forest had gone completely still. She didn't know if the silence meant safety or something worse. Finally, with hands aching from tension, she reached for her phone. Miraculously, she still had a faint signal just enough to call 911. Her voice shook as she spoke to the dispatcher, who assured her that rangers were already in the area and could reach her within 20 minutes by ATV. "Don't be alarmed when you hear the engines," the dispatcher added, trying to sound calm. "Think of them like the cavalry." She hung up and waited every second, crawling. Her finger rested near the trigger, her back pressed against the tent wall, her ears attuned to every sound the night could make. She kept imagining the footsteps coming back, the zipper moving again, the silhouette of someone waiting outside in the dark. When she finally heard the low rumble of engines weaving through the trees, it was like air rushing back into her lungs. Help was coming, but the fear hadn't left. It had simply taken root. The whine of ATVs grew louder until twin beams of light cut through the trees and landed on Lauren's tent. She unzipped it slowly, stepping out with her hands raised and gun lowered, still visibly shaken. 2 forest rangers, one male, one female, introduced themselves as Ranger Dean and Ranger Alexa, their voices steady and calm. Lauren explained everything she'd heard and seen, and they immediately began inspecting the area. Ranger Dean found the trail of partial footprints leading away from her tent, veering off into the thick woods. "Whoever it was didn't run," he said, crouching to examine the spacing. They walked slow and deliberate. That comment sent another chill down Lauren's spine. The rangers didn't find anyone nearby, but they didn't press her to stay either. When Ranger Alexa offered to escort her back to her car, Lauren accepted without hesitation. As they rode back through the forest, bumping over roots and loose gravel in the dark, she didn't look back at the tent she'd left behind. It didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like survival. And as the glow of the trailhead parking lot came into view, the only thing she could think was how quickly peace had turned to terror. The drive home was a blur of headlights and highway signs, but the fear didn't fade with the distance. That night, Lauren sat awake in her apartment, Glock still on the coffee table, trying to make sense of what had happened and what hadn't. She hadn't pulled the trigger. She hadn't even seen the person's face. But what shook her wasn't just the fear of being attacked. It was the realization of how close she'd come to possibly taking a life. All the hours at the shooting range, all the self-defense classes, they had prepared her for action, but not for the emotional gravity of it. Her instructor used phrases like "stop the threat" and "neutralize the danger," always clinical, always detached. But there was nothing detached about that moment. The fear, the hesitation, the calculation of whether to fire or hold, it had all been painfully human. She realized that night that the decision to carry a gun wasn't just about safety. It was a commitment to something far heavier, the possibility of ending a life even in defense of your own. That knowledge clung to her like morning fog. She hadn't fired, but she had changed. And no amount of training could have prepared her for that. In the weeks that followed, Lauren returned to the woods, but never alone. She still loved the quiet, the scent of pine, the rustle of wind through the trees, but something fundamental had shifted. Solitude no longer felt serene. It felt exposed. She began hiking with friends, choosing trails where others were always within shouting distance. Her Glock stayed in her pack, but now it carried a different weight, less comfort, more responsibility. Lauren didn't let fear dictate her life, but she also didn't pretend the experience hadn't changed her. That night in the tent, she hadn't fired her weapon. She hadn't had to. But something inside her had been rewired forever. Not broken, just awakened to a harsher kind of truth. Sometimes Lauren would replay that night in her mind, not to relive the fear, but to understand who she had been in that moment. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't frozen. She'd spoken up, taken control, and defended her space. But she also hadn't glorified it afterward. There were no triumphant retellings, no social media posts claiming a close call. What haunted her most wasn't what could have happened, but what she might have done, what she might have had to do. That quiet moment before the footsteps faded, when her finger hovered over the trigger, taught her something no class ever could. Survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about restraint. And sometimes real courage isn't in the action itself, it's in the terrifying pause before it. In the fall of 2017, something deeply unsettling happened to a quiet family in Edmonton, Alberta. Martin Ellsworth, a 53-year-old office technician known for his love of gadgets and dislike of the outdoors, made a baffling decision. Practically overnight, he purchased brand new camping gear, packed up the family's 2 aging dogs, and drove nearly 900 miles north to a remote area known as Timberwolf Lake in the Northwest Territories. It was the kind of place most Canadians hadn't even heard of: isolated, icy, and largely untouched wilderness. Martin told his wife and son Jackson that he'd return in 2 weeks, but he never came back. What began as a strange personal retreat quickly turned into a missing persons case that continues to haunt those who knew him. Years later, no one has found a body, a clue, or a clear reason why Martin vanished. For those who knew Martin Ellsworth, his sudden fascination with the outdoors wasn't just strange, it was completely out of character. Martin was the kind of man who preferred heated rooms, strong Wi-Fi, and tinkering with electronics over anything involving dirt bugs or unpredictable weather. Camping, especially in a place as unforgiving as the Northwest Territories, was the last thing anyone expected him to pursue. What made it even weirder was the dogs. Martin had always treated Riley and Boone, the family's aging Labrador mixes, with thinly veiled disdain. He refused to walk them, never fed them, and often called them smelly old freeloaders. Yet somehow, in the weeks leading up to his trip, something changed. He began brushing their fur, speaking to them softly, and even said they deserved a real adventure. His wife Helen and son Jackson were stunned. It was as if a switch had flipped overnight. Some family members joked about a midlife crisis. Others wondered if he was hiding something deeper. But Martin never offered a real explanation, just vague comments about needing space and wanting to see something wild before winter came. Then one Friday morning in late September, he loaded the dogs into his Ford Escape and drove off. It was the last time they saw him. Martin Ellsworth's departure felt surreal, but his family clung to the belief that he'd return as promised within 2 weeks. Jackson remembered watching his dad pull out of the driveway, the dogs resting their heads on the back seat, as if this were some strange new chapter they hadn't been invited to read. But when October came and went, without a call, text, or sign of life concern, turned into panic. Helen filed a missing persons report, and within days, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched a limited search around Timberwolf Lake. It wasn't easy terrain, rugged, wet, and largely inaccessible by road. After several days, they located what appeared to be Martin's abandoned campsite. The tent had collapsed. Nearby, they found dog supplies, some canned food, and oddly, a container of marine wax, typically used to seal the bottom of canoes. But there was no sign of Martin, no sign of the dogs, and no canoe. The search was widened, but nothing else turned up. For the Ellsworths, it wasn't just that Martin was missing, it was how deliberately everything seemed to have been set down, as if he had simply stood up, walked away, and vanished. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger things became. For one, Martin had no known experience with boating, let alone canoeing across icy, unpredictable northern lakes. No one in the family recalled him ever expressing interest in water sports. Yet, the presence of marine wax suggested he had either borrowed or purchased a canoe, though no records of such a purchase were ever found. Even more puzzling, an aerial search weeks later revealed a man and 2 dogs walking along the tree line near Timberwolf Lake. By the time authorities reached the area, the man was gone. No tracks, no campsite, nothing new, just silence. When RCMP expanded the search to nearby Yellowknife, the largest city in the Northwest Territories, they hit another dead end. There was speculation Martin might have visited an old college friend, Derek Lorne, in Fort Smith. But Derek claimed he hadn't seen Martin in years and had no idea he was even in the north. Despite scattered tips and speculative sightings, no one could confirm where Martin had gone or why. The facts didn't just fail to add up. They seemed to deliberately resist resolution, as if Martin had vanished by design. Eventually, the official theory settled into something grim but familiar. Martin Ellsworth had likely died from exposure or suffered a fatal accident somewhere in the backcountry. The RCMP pointed to the brutal conditions, sub-zero nights, unpredictable terrain, and waters that remained near freezing, even in spring. They suggested he might have fallen into the lake while trying to use a canoe, and without anyone around to pull him out. Hypothermia could have set in within minutes. It was a sobering possibility. Others speculated that he might have encountered a bear or pack of wolves. After all, northern predators weren't uncommon, and a man traveling with 2 dogs might have unintentionally drawn attention. Still, something about those explanations felt off. Search and rescue teams typically find something: a shoe, a backpack, bones, even scraps of clothing. But in Martin's case, nothing ever turned up after the initial campsite, not even the canoe, which would have been large, buoyant, and brightly colored. Caleb Jackson's friend couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a case of nature claiming a victim. It was a puzzle with a piece deliberately removed. "It's like he erased himself," he once said. Some believed Martin had orchestrated his own disappearance, possibly as a way to escape a life that had quietly suffocated him. Others held fast to the theory of a tragic accident. But regardless of which side you leaned toward, one truth remained: people don't just vanish into nothing unless they want to, or unless something far stranger is at play. For Martin's family, the lack of answers was its own kind of torment. His wife Helen kept his winter coat hanging by the front door for over a year just in case. Their son Jackson refused to delete his father's number from his phone, clinging to the faint hope that one day it might ring. Without a body, there was no closure, no funeral, no eulogy, no chance to say goodbye. Friends offered support, but over time, even sympathy grew quiet. Life moved on for others, but for the Ellsworths, it was like living in a paused moment stretched indefinitely. The pain wasn't loud, it was hollow, slow burning, and in some ways that made it worse. They weren't grieving a death, they were grieving a question. And as the seasons passed, that unanswered question only grew heavier. As the years crept by, the mystery of Martin Ellsworth's disappearance began to shift in tone from tragic to unsettling. Jackson once confided to Caleb that deep down, he sometimes wondered if his father had chosen to disappear. Not out of malice or cruelty, but perhaps out of quiet desperation. Maybe the weight of suburban routine, the hollow arguments, the slow erosion of joy. Maybe it had finally become too much. What if he just wanted out? Jackson asked one night, not looking for an answer. It wasn't easy to accept, but it made a strange kind of sense. Martin hadn't left in chaos or rage. He'd left with calm, even care. He brought the dogs. He packed methodically. He left no mess. Some people vanish by accident. Others vanish by design. The hardest part for those left behind is never knowing which truth applies. Because when a man like Martin disappears, he doesn't just leave behind questions, he becomes one. Whether Martin Ellsworth met a tragic end or quietly stepped into a life no one else could follow, one thing is certain: his story refuses to fade. The passage of time hasn't dulled the weight of his absence, it's only sharpened it. For Helen and Jackson, closure remains a moving target. They still find themselves flinching at unfamiliar phone numbers or slowing down when driving past someone who walks like him. And for Caleb, the story of Martin is a quiet reminder that not every life comes with clean conclusions. Some disappearances don't feel like accidents, they feel like messages. Not ones that are written or spoken, but lived in silence. And the silence in this case says everything. In the fall of 2005, 22-year-old Mallory Green agreed to join her boyfriend Jason Weller and 3 of his longtime friends on a Halloween weekend camping trip to Flatiron Ridge National Forest, just a couple hours outside of Denver. At first, she was hesitant, not because she disliked the outdoors, but because she would be the only woman among 4 men. Jason's friends Tyler, Mick, and Derek had always come across as the type more interested in chugging beers and grilling meat than soaking in nature. Still, Jason reassured her that everything would be fine. He promised they'd picked a stunning campsite and that Mallory would have her privacy and space. Against her better judgment, she agreed. There wasn't anything specific she could point to, but something in her gut felt uneasy, like a quiet hum in the background that never quite went away. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the sense that something wasn't quite aligned. Looking back years later, Mallory would recall that feeling with a chill. Because what happened during that trip, what no one ever fully explained, would haunt her for years. It would make her question the boundaries between trust and denial, between safety and threat. And it would start with what seemed like a perfectly innocent weekend in the woods. Despite Mallory's initial hesitation, the first day of the trip unfolded like something out of an outdoor magazine. The guys, surprisingly considerate and well-prepared, had chosen a campsite that exceeded her expectations. Nestled near the convergence of several forest trails, the spot offered flexible hiking options depending on their mood or hangover level. But what truly amazed her was the natural beauty. Just a short walk down one path lay a crystal-clear waterfall, cascading into a rock basin, offering fresh water for washing and drinking. It wasn't just picturesque, it felt untouched, like they'd stumbled onto a secret piece of Colorado wilderness that belonged in a dream. Jason and his friends set up camp quickly and efficiently, pitching tents with practiced ease and organizing firewood before the sun dipped behind the ridge. They grilled sausages and steaks over an open flame, passed around wine coolers and cheap beer, and shared stories under a sky that turned darker and deeper with every passing hour. Mallory found herself relaxing, laughing, even genuinely enjoying the company of men she had once written off as immature. There were no crude jokes, no pressure, no awkward comments about her and Jason sharing a tent. Just clean air, quiet, pine-scented night, and a sense of unexpected peace. For the first time since she'd stepped into Jason's truck that morning, Mallory's unease began to fade. She even allowed herself to think she'd been wrong, that maybe this trip would be one of those rare memories that age well. She had no idea how wrong she'd be. By the second night, Mallory felt entirely at ease, more than she'd expected. After a full day of hiking the moderate trail loop and rinsing off at the waterfall, she was sore in that satisfying, earned way. As the fire crackled and the last of the burgers sizzled on the grill, she leaned back in her camping chair, wrapped in Jason's hoodie, and looked up at the sky. Stars spilled across the heavens like someone had cracked open a box of salt above the trees. It was one of those rare nights where everything felt aligned, the laughter, the weather, even the timing of the fire dying down. As they all turned in, Jason asked Mallory to stash the cooler and portable stereo in his pickup, parked about 30 feet away. She double-checked the doors after placing the keys in the front pouch of his backpack, just like he asked, before crawling into their tent. Their sleeping arrangement was cozy. Jason slept near the door with his .38 tucked beside him just in case, and Mallory nestled deeper inside, lulled by the rustle of leaves and distant chirps. Before drifting off, she turned to him in the dark and whispered, "Thank you. I wasn't sure about this at first, but it's been kind of perfect." Jason chuckled, half asleep, and squeezed her hand. It would be the last moment of calm either of them would remember clearly, before everything shifted with the dawn. When Mallory unzipped the tent the next morning, she expected crisp air, the smell of pine, maybe some leftover smoke from the fire pit. What she saw instead made her freeze in place. The campsite, which had been so neatly arranged just hours earlier, now looked like it had been ransacked. The fire pit was completely destroyed, rocks scattered like someone had kicked them outward in a fury. The cooler lay on its side, its contents dumped and trampled. Raw meat sat half-buried in pine needles, and beer cans were crumpled and tossed across the clearing. Worst of all, Jason's truck sat with every door hanging open, and the stereo, which had worked fine the night before, was smashed in jagged bits of plastic and wire dangling like entrails. Jason stirred beside her as she sat frozen. When he looked outside, he swore under his breath, crawled forward, and zipped the tent flap higher for a better view. One by one, the others emerged from their tents, in stunned silence. No one said anything at first. It wasn't just the mess, it was the eeriness of it all. No one had heard a thing. Not a branch snap, not a footstep, not even the car doors opening. Just total silence through the night, followed by this. Mallory's unease returned like a sucker punch to the stomach. She dressed quickly, eyes darting around the woods for signs of movement, while the others began arguing. The calm of the night before shattered instantly. Jason accused her of forgetting to lock the truck. She pushed back, swearing she had, because she had a vivid memory of it. But when Jason reached into his backpack to find the keys, the pouch was empty. That was when the fear began to twist into something worse doubt. Jason's accusation hit Mallory like a slap. "You forgot to lock the damn truck, didn't you?" he snapped, standing with his hands on his hips as if the destroyed stereo and scattered food were all her fault. Mallory, still reeling from the chaos outside, snapped back. "Are you serious right now?" She insisted firmly, emotionally, that she had locked the doors and placed the keys exactly where he told her, in the front pouch of his backpack, tucked away at the far side of the tent. Her voice trembled, not just from anger, but from that creeping, dreadful feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Jason stormed over to the tent and yanked his backpack toward him, unzipping it with sharp, impatient movements. He fished around the pouch, then went silent. "They're not here," he muttered. Mallory's heart sank. For a split second, the world around her tilted like she'd lost her footing without moving. She retraced her steps in her head again and again, and finally almost blindly walked toward the truck. And there they were, the keys lying in the dirt just beneath the driver's door. Mallory couldn't explain it. She stammered, trying to make sense of what she was seeing as the arguments around her faded into a muffled hum. Jason stood frozen, staring at the keys, then suddenly went quiet. The air shifted. His anger drained, replaced with something far more unsettling: numbness. He turned to the others and muttered an apology. "Let's pack up," he said. "We're leaving." No one protested. They just moved like sleepwalkers. Whatever had happened that night, none of them wanted to stay long enough to ask more questions. Mallory climbed into the truck, feeling like she was losing her grip on reality. The campsite faded behind them, but the tension in the cab was thick, silent, and suffocating. Jason didn't say a word as he drove, his eyes locked on the road, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. Mallory sat beside him, half turned toward the window, trying to collect her thoughts. Her memory of locking the truck felt vivid and real, so real it almost hurt to question it. And yet, there the keys had been out in the dirt. How had she dropped them? Had someone taken them? Or worse, had Jason? She finally broke the silence, her voice low and shaky. "I know I locked it. I swear to God, Jason." No answer. He just kept driving, expression unreadable. "Please say something," she whispered. Nothing. It wasn't until she started crying quietly, helplessly, that Jason finally spoke. "I believe you," he said flatly. "I believe you." But it didn't feel like comfort. It felt like something someone says when they're trying to believe it themselves. Mallory stared at him, searching for something, any sign of shared fear or confusion. But all she saw was a blank mask. He looked exhausted. More than that, he looked haunted. When they finally pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner, it was Jason who suggested they stop. "I need a minute," he mumbled. Mallory nodded. Not because she understood, but because deep down, she needed one too. Something wasn't adding up. Not the silence. Not the keys. Not Jason. They sat in the parking lot of a sleepy roadside diner, Mallory in the passenger seat still sniffling quietly, and Jason with his head tilted back against the headrest, staring at the stained ceiling fabric like it might hold answers. The silence stretched. Finally, Mallory asked, "What do you think happened?" Jason didn't respond right away. His lips parted like he might say something but then closed again. He looked scared not of her, but of something he hadn't yet figured out how to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and uneven. "You're gonna think I'm crazy," he said. Mallory leaned in. "Try me." He exhaled slowly and began recounting a dream he'd had the night before. It wasn't a full-blown nightmare, he explained, more like a jolt awake. In it, he said he opened his eyes and saw someone crouching over him, 1 foot on either side of his sleeping bag. The face wasn't right. It wasn't wearing a mask. He said it was a mask. Skin tight, like ski mask material stretched across bone. At the time, Jason chalked it up to alcohol and exhaustion. He'd dismissed it and gone back to sleep without waking Mallory. But now, after everything that had happened, the ruined campsite, the missing keys, he wasn't so sure. He looked at her and said, "I didn't think much of it until you found the keys weren't in my bag." Mallory shivered, not because of the story, but because of the way Jason told it. Like it hadn't been a dream at all, like it was a memory trying to slip through. Mallory didn't know what to say after Jason finished. Part of her wanted to ask more questions. What did the man do? Did he move? Did Jason feel anything but? She sensed he wouldn't answer. Not because he didn't remember, but because he didn't want to. As quickly as he'd opened up, he shut back down. Without another word, Jason climbed out of the truck and disappeared into the diner, leaving Mallory alone in the quiet cab. She stared out the windshield, heart racing, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. A masked figure looming over Jason while she slept inches away. It sounded like a dream, except for the way he'd told it, stripped of drama, as if it had been branded into his memory. When he returned a few minutes later with 2 coffees, he handed her one without meeting her eyes. "Let's just go," he muttered. And that was it. No more conversation. No more questions. Ailira held her tongue the rest of the ride. Not because she didn't want answers, but because she realized Jason didn't want to find them. He was scared, not just of what might have happened, but of what he might have done. And that silence was louder than any scream. Mallory thought they'd talk more once they got home, maybe not right away, but eventually. She expected that at some point, Jason would want to unpack what had happened to figure it out together. But when she called him later that evening, his tone was final. He told her he'd spoken with Tyler, Mick, and Derek, and they'd all agreed it was best to just move on. No police report, no forest ranger contact, no insurance claim, despite the smashed stereo and truck damage. Mallory was stunned. Jason had always been borderline obsessive about his truck. He changed the oil early, washed it weekly, never let anyone else drive it. The idea that he'd just eat the cost without filing a report didn't make sense. Unless he didn't want anyone looking too closely. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just avoidance, it was fear, the kind that twists itself around your memory and squeezes until you're not sure what's real. Jason wasn't trying to move past what happened, he was trying to erase it. And the only thing scarier than what might have crept into their camp that night was the growing possibility that Jason had never truly been asleep at all. Mallory never got closure. Not really. Jason stopped bringing up the trip entirely, and any time she tried, he'd change the subject or go silent. Eventually, they broke up, not with some explosive fight, but with the quiet distance that forms when two people stop telling each other the truth. Looking back, Mallory knows that weekend wasn't the only reason they fell apart, but it was definitely one of them. She never forgot the dream he described, or the hollow look in his eyes when she found the keys. Over time, a theory began to take shape in her mind, not a supernatural one, but something scarier in its own way. What if Jason had trashed the campsite himself? Maybe not consciously, maybe in some kind of blackout or dissociative episode, but something about the way he pushed so hard to forget the way he shut everyone down, it didn't feel like denial. It felt like self-protection. She still wonders about it sometimes. Wonders if he ever told the others what he told her. Wonders if he ever got help. But mostly, she wonders if he remembers. Because if he does, and he's just living with it in silence, well, that's the part that chills her the most. To her knowledge, Jason never went camping again, and neither did she. When Mallory Green found out she had a long weekend off from NYU in early October, she decided to head home to Buffalo. A glamping trip with three of her closest hometown friends? Alyssa, Kendra, and Natalie sounded like the perfect reset before midterms. They booked a cozy campsite at Chestnut Ridge, a spot just outside the city, complete with rustic cabins, fire rings, and picnic tables under blazing red and amber leaves. The first day was idyllic unpacking under the afternoon sun, music drifting through the trees, the kind of peaceful scene you take for granted until it's gone. Not long after they settled in, the girls noticed four guys in the next cabin over. Around the same age, easygoing Buffalo locals. One of them, Bryce Dalton, struck up conversation and, by sundown, invited the girls to join them for some beers and a bonfire. Mallory hesitated, but Natalie, always the extrovert, nudged her forward. "It's fine," she said with a grin. This is what people our age do. The night unfolded like something out of a college memory reel. Laughter, clinking bottles, marshmallows, and classic rock echoing through the woods. Mallory found herself warming up to the vibe, even chatting quietly with Bryce, who seemed friendly, if a bit buzzed. But as the fire died lower and the sky thickened with stars, the energy began to shift. Without warning, Bryce disappeared into his cabin and came back out holding a revolver. At first, everyone thought it was a joke, but the gleam of metal under the firelight silenced the group. "Relax," he slurred. "It's my dad's old piece. Not even loaded." Mallory's heart sank. "Put it away," she said firmly, but her voice was buried under the protests of her friends. Bryce grinned, waving the gun like a toy. "I'll prove it," he said. He raised it skyward and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. Another pull. Click. The girls shrieked, not in fear of bullets, but at the sheer stupidity. Jared and Logan, his friends, pleaded with him to go inside. "You're hammered," Logan muttered, eyes wide. "Sleep it off, man." But Bryce looked offended. Offended. And suddenly quiet. He stared at the gun as if daring it. Then, in one fluid, surreal moment, he placed the revolver to his temple and pulled the trigger. Bang. Time fractured. The ringing in Mallory's ears felt louder than the gunshot. Bryce crumpled instantly, and blood pooled beneath him like a grotesque shadow. Screams erupted, someone dropped a beer bottle, and Alyssa fell to her knees wailing. Mallory snapped into action, not because she knew what to do, but because doing nothing felt like drowning. She pressed her hands to Bryce's neck, checked for signs of life, then screamed for someone to call 911. Kendra took over the call, her voice shaking. The rest were either frozen or sobbing. "He's not going to make it," Mallory whispered to herself. She knew it, but she kept her hands on him anyway. It took over 30 minutes for paramedics to arrive. By then, Bryce was long gone. Jared sat on the cabin stairs in total silence, staring at the forest. Alyssa couldn't stop crying, Every few seconds, she gasped as if replaying the image of Bryce's head snapping back again and again. The days that followed blurred into hospital visits, police interviews, and heavy silences. Mallory learned that what they were experiencing was called acute stress disorder, something like short-term PTSD. Most of them began to recover little by little, but Alyssa never truly came back. She was put on medication and therapy for years. And even now at 25, she still says that night ruined her nervous system. 1 week later, over pancakes at a dusty roadside diner, Mallory sat across from Logan and asked the question that had been festering inside her. Why did he even have that gun? Logan didn't meet her eyes. He always said he liked the thrill of not knowing. Once told me he liked spinning the chamber and hearing the click. He paused. Guess this time the thrill won. Mallory didn't respond. She just stared down at her coffee, black and bitter. There was no investigation. It was ruled a tragic, self-inflicted accident. The campground didn't issue a statement. No lawsuits. No memorial. Just a bloody circle in the dirt and a group of 20-year-olds left to carry the fallout. Mallory never went glamping again. Never drank around strangers again. And though she still believes in the Second Amendment, that night made something clear: a gun in the wrong hands at the wrong moment turns comfort into carnage. Years later, she told the story to her boyfriend, me, over wine and candlelight. I remember her eyes didn't water, but her fingers wouldn't stop twitching. She finished the story with a line that still haunts me. People think gun deaths are about crime or revenge, but sometimes it's just a party, a forest, a stupid boy with a loaded weapon, and no one brave enough to pull it away. Caleb Wren wasn't your typical outdoorsman. At 29, he'd spent nearly his entire life in the heart of Leeds, working as a full-time software engineer, living off meal-prepped lunches, Amazon Prime, and late-night Reddit scrolls. Nature to him was a public park with clean benches and pigeons. But everything shifted the year after the lockdowns. Staring at screens for 16 hours a day and navigating a constant stream of digital noise had left Caleb feeling burnt out, mentally drained, and disconnected from something he couldn't quite name. The turning point came while binging a survival series late one night. A washed-up pop singer was fumbling with a flint striker in the Amazon, and for some reason, the struggle ignited something in Caleb. What would he do, stranded in the wild with nothing but a knife and his wits? Could he survive without GPS DoorDash, or even a basic phone signal? At first, it was just a joke among friends. Imagine me in the woods without Wi-Fi, he'd say. But somewhere between curiosity and self-doubt, the idea of solo camping grew roots. His friends laughed it off, of course. They imagined plush campsites with nearby diners and bathrooms, not mud bugs and eerie silence. Caleb, though, wanted more than a weekend escape. He wanted to find out if he could depend entirely on himself in a place that didn't care who he was or what he did for a living. He began reading survival blogs, watching gear reviews, and planning simple trips to nearby national parks. Those first few nights alone under the stars were clumsy but liberating. With each trip, he carried less, trusted himself more, and found an odd kind of peace in being utterly alone. Caleb didn't go seeking enlightenment, but he discovered something close to it: perspective. In the wild, things made sense. Fire burned, water cooled, and silence wasn't a threat. The chaos of city life faded, replaced by wind, animal sounds, and the slow rhythm of nature. For the first time in years, he felt clear-headed. So when he read about a place called Dunmore Forest, a remote patch of wilderness with no cell service and no marked trails, he didn't hesitate. This wasn't a vacation. It was a personal experiment, one that would either prove his resilience or reveal his limits. Caleb didn't just stop with one weekend out in the woods, he was hooked. After that first shaky attempt at wild camping, which included a half-burned meal and a nearly collapsed tarp setup, he returned to his apartment with aching shoulders and a strange sense of pride. Instead of feeling defeated, he felt sharper, mentally clearer. It wasn't just about proving something to himself anymore. The woods had stirred something deeper, something primal. Over the next 2 years, Caleb planned a series of solo excursions, some quick overnights in the Yorkshire moors, others multi-day hikes through Lake District valleys. He avoided tourist spots and polished trails, always choosing the quieter, more remote corners of the map. The further from people, the more peace he found. At first, he brought too much. His backpack was loaded with gear he didn't know how to use, and his idea of campfire cooking involved prepackaged meals and way too many protein bars. But gradually, he pared things down. With each outing, he became leaner in his planning, more confident in his instincts. He learned to light fires with damp kindling, set up a tarp in the dark, and even navigate using a compass when GPS failed. There were no earth-shattering revelations, just small, steady victories that built a quiet kind of self-reliance. What surprised him most, though, was how much he craved the silence. In a world buzzing with notifications and filtered noise, the woods gave him something rarer than solitude. They gave him stillness. Not the kind that felt empty, but the kind that felt full. The whisper of wind through trees, the snap of twigs under his boots, even the lonely calls of distant owls became comforting. Those sounds, once alien, now felt like part of him. Friends back home couldn't relate. They joked that he was turning into some kind of forest monk. But Caleb didn't care. He wasn't running from life. He was running towards something, toward clarity perhaps, or the version of himself that wasn't numbed by routine. That's why when he stumbled upon a mention of Dunmore Forest, a place so isolated it barely existed on Google Maps, he felt that old spark again. Only this time it burned brighter. This wouldn't be just another solo trip. This would be the ultimate test. The mention of Dunmore Forest didn't come from a travel blog or some glossy guidebook. It was buried deep in a comment thread on a backcountry gear forum. A user with the handle GreyFox73 had mentioned it almost in passing, calling it the loneliest patch of woods in the UK, and warning almost theatrically that if you got in trouble there, God help you, 'cause no one else can. Caleb's interest was instant. He looked it up and found barely anything. No official campsite maps, no guided trails, not even many photos. What he did find, though, was chilling in the most enticing way. No signal, no ranger presence, and in the middle of the region, a 2-day hike in any direction just to reach a road. To Caleb, that wasn't a deterrent. It was a dare. He spent the next month preparing. His pack was stripped to the essentials: shelter, fire kit, knife, compact stove, freeze-dried meals, thermal clothing, a laminated topographic map, and an old-school compass. For safety, he left his itinerary with a coworker and set a check-in deadline. The rest? It would be up to him. He took a train north to Carlisle, then rented a small hatchback and drove across the Scottish border. After a long, misty drive, he arrived in Briarstead, a village so small it didn't have a single traffic light. There, he rented a room at a local inn called the Heatherbell for one night. The innkeeper, a wiry man in his 60s with clouded blue eyes, looked baffled when Caleb explained his plan to solo hike into Dunmore. "You're going into those woods alone?" the man asked, glancing out the window like something might be watching. "I wouldn't go near that place without a dog, a rifle, and a damn good reason." Caleb smiled politely, brushing off the warning. He'd heard it all before from friends, coworkers, even random strangers on Reddit. But something about this man's tone wasn't dismissive or mocking. It was worried. Not the performative kind, but deeply unsettled. Still, Caleb chalked it up to small-town superstition and assured him he'd be fine. The next morning, just as the sky turned a soft Scottish gray, Caleb parked his car at a ranger trailhead and slung his pack onto his back. He looked out across the tree line where the fog clung low and heavy. What lay beyond was miles of unmarked terrain, the kind of wilderness where a man could find answers or lose himself trying. Caleb took a breath, adjusted his straps, and stepped forward. The first day in Dunmore felt like walking into a painting no one had finished. Trees rose like silent witnesses on either side of the narrow trail. Caleb followed for the first mile until the path simply vanished. No signs, no markers, just wild terrain. The fog was still hanging low, softening the edges of everything, and swallowing sound. Every footstep felt exaggerated, crunching on damp leaves and brittle twigs. For someone used to the manic pulse of the city, the silence was almost confrontational. But to Caleb, it was perfect. He was finally where he'd been aiming to be for months, off-grid, off-map, and entirely alone. He kept a steady pace through most of the morning, crossing uneven ground, skirting muddy depressions, and climbing a shallow ridgeline that offered his first full glimpse of the valley below. It was wild in the truest sense, untouched, sprawling, and completely indifferent to his presence. No smoke, no cabins, no distant voices, just miles of forest and raw earth stretching in every direction. By early afternoon, Caleb found a flat stretch near a small brook ringed by low brush and flanked by young birch trees, an ideal first campsite. He set to work building his shelter, a simple lean-to, using a poncho and paracord, and gathered kindling while the light still held. Starting a fire took longer than expected, the air damp and heavy, but it was worth it. The flicker of flame brought a primitive kind of comfort, anchoring him to the moment. Dinner was a pouch of chili mac and a tin cup of cocoa eaten while crouched beside the fire. Caleb scribbled in his notebook, recording Weatherbearing's small thoughts. The world felt honest out here. No likes, no deadlines, no curated perfection. Just a man, the woods, and whatever came with the night. As dusk set in, the trees became silhouettes, the sky a deepening bruise. He zipped into his sleeping bag beneath the lean-to, listening to wind move through branches. It was the good kind of quiet, the kind that hums like truth. Tomorrow, he'd push deeper. Tonight, he felt ready. Caleb woke up to a pale, overcast sky and the soft gurgle of the brook beside his camp. His second day in Dunmore began with a sense of calm and purpose. He boiled water for instant coffee, packed up camp with practiced ease, and checked his compass. Today's goal was simple: head northeast, toward a wooded ridge that looked promising for his next shelter. The air was cool, the forest still damp from the night's dew, and his boots squelched faintly with each step. There were no signs of animals, no birdsong, no scurrying in the brush, which struck him as strange but not alarming. Dunmore, after all, was wild in ways the other forests hadn't been. This was uncurated nature. It wasn't designed to entertain. Around midday, Caleb reached the base of the ridge. The climb wasn't particularly steep, but it was long and exposed. There were no trees for shade, no cover if the weather turned. As he made his way upward, the world behind him opened up, revealing endless gray-green hills and patches of bogland that looked like a quilt stitched by something ancient. When he paused to catch his breath near the top, he realized something else. He hadn't seen a single human footprint, broken branch, or discarded wrappers since entering the forest. There were no markers of other people. It was as if no one else had ever stepped foot here. Once he crested the ridge, the land dipped sharply into a narrow, windswept valley. A mile or so ahead, he spotted a cluster of trees nestled in a shallow basin, the first decent tree cover he'd seen since leaving camp that morning. That would be his second sight. The walk there was slower. He felt more exposed now, as if the forest had somehow thinned out its protection and left him standing in a raw, ancient silence. The kind of quiet that didn't just surround you, it pressed in. By the time he reached the trees, Caleb felt both eager to set up and oddly unsettled. It wasn't fear exactly, just a prickling sense that something had shifted subtly, imperceptibly. Like being watched, even if your brain insists you aren't. But again, he shrugged it off. This was part of the test. Dunmore wasn't here to make him comfortable. It was here to show him who he really was when no one else was watching. The second night in Dunmore was quieter than the first, but not in a comforting way. After setting up camp, beneath the dense canopy of birch and alder trees, Caleb went about his routine. He boiled water, rehydrated a pouch of beef stew, and sat cross-legged by the fire eating slowly, trying to shake the strange unease that had followed him since the ridge. The woods weren't hostile, they weren't even noisy, but something about the stillness had shifted. It no longer felt neutral. It felt aware. When he finished eating, he poured himself a half mug of cocoa, his nightly ritual, and placed the enamel cup carefully beside the fire ring. There wasn't much left in it, just a couple ounces. But part of him was curious. Would the embers keep it warm by morning? It was a small, harmless experiment. With that, he settled into his sleeping bag beneath the poncho shelter, the fire still casting a soft glow through the mesh of trees. Within minutes, exhaustion took him. Sometime in the early morning, Caleb stirred. It wasn't a sound that woke him. It was a feeling, a strange sense of alertness. He didn't sit up, didn't unzip his bag. He just lay there, eyes closed, wondering what had changed. But eventually, fatigue reclaimed him. The next time he opened his eyes, dawn had broken. The fire had died down to cold gray ash. Birds were chirping faintly in the distance, the first real wildlife sounds he'd heard in days. Caleb stretched, sat up slowly, and then glanced toward the fire pit to check on the cup. That's when everything shifted. The cup was gone. At first, he thought he might have knocked it over during the night, or moved it absent-mindedly. But a quick scan of the area turned up nothing until he spotted it perched, perfectly upright, on the top of a nearby fallen log. That might have been strange enough. But when he stepped closer and peered inside, his stomach turned. The cocoa was gone, but in its place sat a single long blade of grass, tied neatly with small deliberate knots up and down the stem. 3 total. Caleb stood frozen. He hadn't moved the cup. He hadn't touched the grass. Someone else had been there. Someone had entered his camp while he was dead asleep, picked up the cup, and without taking anything or leaving damage had placed it on display with a message too eerie to miss. I was here, and I could have done more. The warmth of the fire was gone. So was any illusion of safety. Caleb stared at the cup for nearly a full minute, his breath shallow and his mind racing. The knots in the grass weren't random. They were precise, too deliberate to be the work of wind or wildlife. Someone had been close. Not just near his camp, but in it, bending down beside his sleeping form, touching his things, watching him. The realization came with a surge of nausea. This wasn't just creepy, it was dangerous. And more than that, it was intentional. Whoever had done it hadn't tried to hurt him, but they'd sent a message that couldn't be misunderstood. I was close enough to do anything I wanted. The fire had long gone cold. The birds were singing now, cheerfully indifferent. But Caleb no longer felt like part of the landscape. He felt exposed. He grabbed his knife, nothing more than a 5-inch folding blade, and scanned the surrounding woods. Nothing. No movement. No sound. No footprints. That made it worse. If someone could move in and out that quietly, they could still be watching. Maybe from behind a tree. Maybe from the ridge. Maybe just waiting. He packed in under 10 minutes, no breakfast, no hesitation. His routine was gone. Everything was about urgency now. He considered heading deeper into Dunmore, sticking to his original plan, but quickly dismissed it. This wasn't just about fear. It was about risk. Staying meant gambling with someone who didn't announce themselves, who chose to communicate through subtle psychological violation. That wasn't a fellow hiker or a lost camper. That was someone who understood the power of presence and chose to use it like a weapon. The map showed a long route westward over the same ridge he'd crossed the day before. If he made it across, he'd eventually reach a forestry road near a place called Glen Truach. It would mean hiking all day and most of the night, but it was the only path out that didn't involve doubling back toward the area he now considered compromised. As he threw the last of his gear into the pack, Caleb paused and looked again at the cup, still resting on the log, still holding the knotted grass. He didn't touch it. He didn't want to. Instead, he turned away and started walking, the hair on the back of his neck still standing tall. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. The trek westward began with adrenaline, but by mid-morning, Caleb was running on grit alone. His legs burned from the incline, and his shoulders ached under the weight of his pack. The air had gone still again. No breeze, no birdsong, just the steady crunch of his boots on loam and stone. He kept checking over his shoulder, scanning the ridge lines and the tree lines for movement. Nothing. But that didn't comfort him. In fact, it made everything worse. The absence of proof wasn't proof of absence. Whoever had entered his camp the night before had done so without making a sound. For all he knew, they could still be out there, watching. He didn't stop for more than a minute at a time, just long enough to sip water or choke down a protein bar before moving again. Each pause felt like a risk. The wide, treeless slope on the western side of the ridge offered nowhere to hide, just rolling grasslands, broken by the occasional boulder or low shrub. It felt like walking across a giant's back, fully visible to anything that cared to look. By late afternoon, the sun hung low behind a bank of clouds, casting long, gray shadows across the hills. Caleb's mind started playing tricks on him. He thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a shape between trees, a shadow in the brush, but each time he looked directly, it was gone. The isolation was sinking in. His legs were shaky, and his thoughts were looping. What if they followed me? What if they're ahead now? What if they're circling? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker with a weird sense of humor. Maybe a local who liked scaring off campers. But then he thought of the knots. 3 perfect knots tied carefully, almost ritualistically. That wasn't a prank. That was a message, and it hadn't been rushed. Whoever had done it had taken their time. Night fell fast, as it does in the highlands. Caleb pushed forward anyway, headlamp off, relying on moonlight. His boots catching on roots and rocks as he descended into the next valley. He didn't dare camp. Stopping meant sleeping. Sleeping meant vulnerability. So he kept walking. The terrain turned rough, thick with brambles and ankle-deep marsh. At one point, he slipped and landed hard, mud splashing across his coat wrist, throbbing from the impact. He lay still for a moment, staring up at the stars, through a gap in the canopy, chest heaving. But even then, no part of him wanted to stay down. He crawled to his feet, spat grit from his mouth, and kept going. At some point, time lost meaning. There was only the sound of his breath, the pulse in his ears, and the dark ahead. And then, at last, a silhouette. A roofline. A structure. Glen Truock. He had made it. Caleb stumbled toward it, legs trembling, not with triumph, but with the exhaustion of someone who had narrowly escaped something they still couldn't name. The building at Glen Truock wasn't much, a squat, weather-beaten forestry shelter with flaking green paint and a tin roof that rattled in the wind. But to Caleb, it looked like salvation. He staggered to the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was dry. He dropped his pack, peeled off his soaked outer layers, and collapsed onto a wooden bench with a groan that felt like it came from somewhere deep in his bones. For the first time in nearly 20 hours, he let himself exhale. He was inside. He was alone, and as far as he could tell, safe. His muscles screamed. His mind buzzed. But slowly the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by something quieter, relief. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, but he didn't bother to look. He didn't want to know what was out there anymore. Whatever had followed him, or maybe just found him, was part of the woods now. And he was done with the woods. He didn't sleep much, just dozed in short, twitchy bursts. His ears stayed alert, tuned to every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind that passed over the roof like a whisper. But no footsteps, no movement, no strange gifts left behind. When daylight finally crept in through the dusty window panes, it felt like a curtain lifting. Caleb stood slowly, his joints stiff and looked around the shelter one last time. It wasn't much, but it had been enough. He left just after dawn, following the forestry road that would eventually lead him back to his car and eventually back to the world. He didn't look back at Dunmore. He didn't need to. Part of it would follow him forever, silent, patient, and impossible to forget. Back in Leeds, everything felt louder. Traffic lights blinked with robotic urgency. Strangers barked into phones on crowded sidewalks, and the constant hum of the city buzzed behind Caleb's eyes like a swarm. It was strange how quickly routine swallowed him again, but something had shifted. He didn't tell many people about what happened in Dunmore, not in detail. When friends asked how the trip went, he offered a casual shrug and a clipped wild but good. The truth, though, sat deeper. It lived in the pauses between thoughts, in the way he now double-checked locks at night, or how he instinctively scanned every wooded area he passed. He kept the enamel cup, though he never drank from it again. It sat on a high shelf in his apartment, clean, but untouched, the reminder of a moment that changed him. Not because of violence or injury, but because of what could have been. Whoever or whatever had entered his camp hadn't wanted to hurt him. That's what haunted him most. They wanted him to know they could have. That silent assertion of power unsettled him in a way he couldn't shake. Caleb didn't go camping again after that. Not alone anyway. Not in places where cell towers didn't reach. But he also didn't regret the journey. Dunmore had tested him. It had shown him a version of himself he hadn't met before, resilient. Alert and deeply human in the face of something he still couldn't explain. He never solved the mystery. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Some questions, he realized, don't need answers, just respect and distance. Years later, Caleb would sometimes find himself staring at that old enamel cup on the shelf, the knots in the grass long since faded from memory, but never from meaning. He never figured out who had been out there with him or why they left that quiet message. But in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson it carved into him. The woods don't always whisper warnings, you just have to know when to listen. If this story gave you chills, made you think, or simply kept you hooked, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on the notification bell so you never miss the next strange and unforgettable tale. Your support means the world and helps this channel keep digging into the stories most people are too afraid to tell. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.